Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the California Fire Science Seminar Series, hosted by myself. I'm Crystal Colden at the University of California, Merced. My co-hosts in this endeavor are Dr. Jeanette Cobian-Enriquez also from the University of California, Merced, and Dr. Michael Gallner from the University of California, Berkeley. We are pleased to bring you this seminar series every week this semester that is being very kindly hosted and supported by UC Berkeley, and also supported in partnership with the California Fire Science Consortium. This week we are delighted to have Dr. Amanda Stasiewicz, who is going to be speaking on the human dimensions of wildfire. I've actually known Amanda for quite a few years because we were both at the University of Idaho prior to our sojourns to California. So Amanda has just joined San Jose State University. Her original location, I guess you could say, is she comes to us from New York, actually, and so her bachelor's is in environmental science from Siena College, and then she moved out west to Idaho, where she earned her master's and her doctorate, and she's currently an assistant professor, as I noted, in environmental studies at SJSU, and she's a human dimensions specialist within SJSU's new Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center. So she focuses on the intersection of people, their wildfire environment, and policy. And she looks at community adaptation and changing wildfire conditions, local preparation for and in response to wildfire events, and some of the citizen agency partnerships that have formed for addressing landscape level wildfire resilience. So with that, I will hand it over to Amanda Stasiewicz. Before I hand it over, I will remind you that at the end of this, I will have a brief question and answer session. If you have a question, everyone that's a participant in the webinar is muted, both audibly and with video. If you have a question, please put it in I feel like we have a Q&A. There we go. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, on the control bar, there is a Q&A box or button you can click, and the Q&A is available to insert your questions in, and then we will get some of those questions answered at the end of the talk. And then, of course, at 4 o'clock, we also have a more of a chat discussion session that is in a different Zoom room. So we will move out of this webinar and into the Zoom room at 4 o'clock, where you can ask additional questions of Dr. Stasiewicz. So that link was sent out to all of the members of this listserv. And if there's anyone else that didn't get that link, then we can try and figure out other opportunities to send that out. So with that, now for real, I will hand it over to Amanda. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Crystal, for the introduction, and thanks everyone else for having me. So my focus, as Crystal mentioned, is the human dimensions of wildfire. I really enjoy working in spaces around cooperation around fire risk management, and the scaling up of kind of the social scale or social nuance of adapting to fire to some of our more landscape level fire resilience goals. So one of the things that has been, kind of in a lot of headlines around fire adaptation has been this conversation about how fire is a people problem. And this is something that comes up a lot in the California context, related to, is it a design problem? Is it the way we're designing our communities? Is it the way we're developing? Is it that people aren't taking fire seriously? Is it about suppression? What is the fire problem? And it's really, as it is with many aspects of fire, it's really challenging to kind of, give journalists or give people a 2 to 5 line, like really simple answer, because part of the context and part of why the human dimensions of fire is so exciting is that there's so much nuance to it. We have different types of communities that make up our fire-prone landscapes and our fire-prone spaces, and they're going to adapt different ways. There's going to be things that are either socially palatable or politically palatable in different ways in these different community contexts. So when we talk about, addressing the fire problem, right, the cohesive wildland fire management strategy gives us those three pillars. One of them, as we all know, is the, increasing fire risk and promoting landscape level fire resilience. And those of us who have, experience, if you're in the West, this isn't new to you. The next pillar on this is the idea of fire adapted communities, and the issue of the fire problem is considered to be in areas of the wildland urban interface, so areas that are adjacent to or intermixed with wildland vegetation. And how do we protect our expanding WUI from fire? How do we deal with fire risk in these spaces that either are already existing or that we're continuing to expand into? And one of the terms that we've used for thinking about how we're living with fire or how can we live with fire is fire adapted communities. And that comes from, this idea that we have in ecology about fire adapted plant communities or ecosystems and fire dependent systems and communities, and tries to apply the same terminology to the social landscape. That if you're going to occupy the same landscape, you should be adapting to the fire circumstances or fire history, whatever it is of that space. And that is something that we've been, kind of using as a messaging tool for our policymakers and for the communities living in these spaces. But as I kind of alluded to already, people are not all the same in all different places, right? So you have kind of these different spaces and different community types that occupy wildfire-prone areas. So you'll have places like Rancho Santa Fe that are gated communities, and they're going to adapt very differently than a ski mountain or resort community is going to adapt. That'll be very different from more of a cabin-based or I have my home around trees in a rural setting kind of community, and they're going to adapt differently than a working landscape community that might be predominantly used in branching or agriculture or in logging. And so all of these community types need different ways to adapt. And so Travis Pavalio has done a lot of work on this, and Matt Carroll and some other folks with coming up with this idea of social archetypes to kind of help us wrap our heads around what is the people problem with fire and how do we move forward. And so some of the work that I've been doing has been kind of emulating this. But another caveat of this is a safe and effective wildfire response. And part of that and the context around that is what we're seeing for sure now in the California 2020 fire season, but also in the 2015, 2017 fire seasons as a whole, is this increasing demand for initial attack, for fire suppression resources, and on fire service organizations. So that might be state and federal, as you can see here, with resource requests that we're unable to fill, but also cascades down to the local level, to our rural fire departments, to other ways that we can get citizens involved and engaged in fire suppression. And this is part of that idea of fire adapted communities. These are communities that can deal with fire events when they do come through. And that's going to include prevention and preparation, but also potentially what our response is during a fire event. So I'm going to tackle kind of these three things through three studies that I'm going to bring you through with me today. The first one's going to be on cooperative wildfire management in mosaic landscapes. So this is the idea that there are different land ownership types, different social groups on landscape sharing, the idea of a fire shed, sharing this space where there is shared landscape fire risk. How do we build up at social scales that are meaningful to address landscape level fire risk? The next project I'm going to bring you through is going to talk about rural residents' perceptions of fire service organizations, so like their local fire departments, their capabilities and capacities for dealing with fire risk, and how that or whether that influences the home ignition zone mitigations or the fire-wise actions they're implementing on their private property. And the last project I'm going to talk you through is going to look at intended evacuation behaviors and how that relates to home ignition zone treatments and action performance. So whether people are preparing for their property for fire based on what their intended evacuation behavior is going to be. So this first one, I'm going to talk about cooperative wildfire management in a mosaic landscape. And I'm focusing in on some of the work I've done with Rangeland Fire Protection Associations and kind of the Great Basin Desert in southern Idaho. And I'll give you a little bit more context around this as we move forward, but it's characterized by sagebrush steppe, ecosystems. And so kind of what a Rangeland Fire Protection Association is this partnership between agencies and private citizens to address wildfires that are on this landscape that's mostly characterized by public lands. So typically this is BLM dominated landscapes. It's where ranchers have their grazing leases. And some of it is IDL checkerboards going throughout Idaho Department of Lands. They're wildfire specific, so they are not getting the same training as a fire department would. They can't engage in structure protection. They only address wildland fire events. And the reason that they created this organization was that historically ranching communities have this legacy of being self-sufficient and also addressing natural resource issues as a community on their own. And part of this kind of philosophy for many of them was already responding to wildfire events on their public grazing leases as initial attack informally. So they did not have training, they did not have radios, they weren't tying in with Bureau of Land Management or other agencies that were responsible for fire protection on that landscape. Creating a lot of safety and liability concerns, both for the civilian that was responding and for the incident commanders and firefighters that were part of the professional groups that were responding on that landscape. And what this program did was create a policy avenue to legitimize that informal network that was already there among the ranchers. It gave them the ability to respond to fires on public lands, and they got their Wildland Firefighter Type 2 certifications. They learned a bit about fire behavior. They got radios. They put radio repeaters out on the landscape so they could increase communications. And what they end up doing is utilizing their privately owned equipment and volunteering their time. They're part of an NGO. So they go out on the landscape with their equipment that they're already using in their operations, whether it's ranching or agriculture, such as dozers and water tanks, to basically be extra boots on the ground for agencies that might be experiencing resource scarcity issues or who might be too far away, not have enough staged equipment out on the landscape. This increases that by enabling ranchers on their various homesteads to have equipment that we can use in fire response. Now, why is this so important on sagebrush dominated landscapes? So what we've seen and what many of us may already be familiar with is the conversion of sagebrush steppe landscapes to annual grasslands through a cheatgrass wildfire return cycle. And basically what we're doing here is we're losing a lot of sagebrush landscape to this annual grassland kind of space, which has ramifications for the sage grouse, which has been up for listing several times. We have secretarial order, kind of focusing on keeping fires small as a solution. And at the same, so this creates, a multi-agency interest in keeping fires small on rangeland landscapes. But also we had the civilian interest, the citizen interest from ranchers who had spent maybe 10 out of 12 years by the time I did the study, in 2016, that had been burnt off of their federal grazing leases for 10 out of 12 years. And what that does is it creates this huge economic toll on them when they cannot use their leases. So what I wanted to know, a lot of the study that the research that had already been done in Idaho and in Oregon had focused on these larger versions of this program being implemented in rangeland landscapes. So they were in kind of these areas of southern Idaho, for example, or other spaces that were predominantly public lands, which is this yellow is BLM, the blue checkerboard is IDL, Idaho Department of Lands. So they had predominantly been implemented on landscapes that were dominated by ranching and dominated by public lands. And I wanted to look in a space, especially in the context of rangeland conversion to, with suburban sprawl and division into, ranchettes and some of, that idea of land conversion. How can this program still be implemented in rangelands and need protecting when we start having more fragmented landscapes? And so I decided to focus in on something that would be closer to that mosaic kind of analogy, which ended up being this RFPA up here called the Black Canyon RFPA. And I wanted to know what elements or what influences there were in the establishment and functioning of that RFPA and what the management mosaic actually meant for operating in that space. And so one of the reasons why this space is fragmented, why it wasn't a contiguous jurisdiction, was the fact that this program was only implemented in Idaho in 2012. And by then there were, of course, other entities out there with fire protection responsibility. And in this space, there was quite a bit of residential development. And so all of these adjacent polygons are rural fire departments. So there's 11 rural fire departments in this area, with obviously protecting enough homes that warrant a tax base. And several of them had agreements with the RFPA, and some of them decided not to engage in cooperative fire management agreements, mutual aid agreements. And that is part of the story here. I did interviews with ranchers, with RFPA members, with the fire professionals who either had helped start the RFPA or had interacted with them on fire events, to kind of get at this, the influences on individual and collective decisions to form the RFPA, and factors influencing their responses in when they were responding to a fire event. And also their interactions with the different fire suppression organizations that were involved in landscape level fire management in this area. So what we found in this study was that partnerships were an important thing here for creating the RFPA, but also that it was really helping them get around actual roadblocks. So in an area that has more people, you're going to have an increased law enforcement presence in a lot of cases, and the ranchers are running into problems returning from town to their grazing allotments to evacuate their cattle and their livestock. And this obviously made for a very contentious space, and this was kind of a, not that this wasn't occurring in other RFPAs, but in that more remote or rural landscape, this wasn't as big of a driver in influencing RFPA creation. The existence of RFPAs in the state already, the support they were getting, this was really advocated for by state senators, by the governor, for this to become something that proliferated across all of Idaho as a way to deal with fire risk in rangeland landscapes, but also a way to augment federal response capabilities on these more remote areas. Having those pre-existing range and fire protection associations created this model and history of documentation that could then be applied to this new, complicated in different ways context. So the RFPA was able to take the documentation and some of the lessons already learned by other ranchers in the larger ranching community in southern Idaho and apply it to their local context, to engage in conversations with the rural fire departments that were so prominent in their area. And it's what the rural fire departments were largely concerned of, why they weren't initially very welcoming in this landscape of these additional boots on the ground assistance, was competition that they were worried about. They were worried about competing for volunteer firefighter funding that is used by rural fire departments to fund a lot of what they do, a lot of their work. And what some of the interviewees were actually talking about was saying that some of the preferential treatment the RFPAs, Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, had been getting in recent years, the attention from the state, the startup costs and funding, the free PPE, some of this training, made them feel like they were being ignored and undervalued. And they didn't want to have to compete for additional things like the volunteer firefighter funding. I also didn't want to have to compete for things like access to federal surplus equipment, so engines that might be coming down the line. And we're going to new RFPAs. Each RFPA was getting like a new fire engine with the start. The RFPA liaisons were important to go into those spaces and explain that they were an NGO, they weren't going to be for profit, they were going to use their own equipment in fire suppression. And that they didn't have any intention to be going for that volunteer firefighter funding. And that created this space where the rural fire departments were actually really happy to have them there. A lot of these, especially in rural areas, the volunteer fire departments deal with just issues with volunteerism and staffing, but also a lot of them have jobs in nearby cities and were commuting and couldn't be there as quickly as a rancher who's working on the landscape might be. Generally, also, this RFPA was slightly different from some of the other ones that I'd studied because they were just interested in accepting federal equipment because of the limitations that were placed on that equipment. So RFPA members typically utilize the same equipment they use in firefighting, they're using in their agricultural operations to, whether it's a dozer or a disc, or it's a water tank or something that put pesticides in, they can fill it with water in on another, if there's a fire event. You weren't going to be able to do that if you accepted federal equipment. So they weren't actually interested in it because the upkeep costs were not worth it to them unless they could also use it in their operations. So that was a cultural thing that kind of impacted program implementation on this landscape. There were also these discrepancies in the perceived role of the RFPA in landscape fire management. So the rural fire departments were like, great, this is a specialized wildland fire service, kind of, they're going to be at the ready like us, ready to mobilize and go take care of the wildfire. We could focus on the WUI and protecting the homes. And the RFPA had a very different idea. They thought they were going to be backup when resources were low. They thought they were mostly going to be a source of local knowledge. They thought they were going to be going and opening gates and evacuating cattle while radioing in information about the fire, or maybe where they had recently grazed, and that could be a fuel break. So there were very different thoughts about what the role of the RFPA was in the landscape by the different actors. So the big takeaways here was that this concept was proliferating across the state, but was being adapted to elements of local context. It's not that it was working better in either of the spaces. It was still a useful tool for a ranching community to be able to become more fire adapted. There was an additional need to negotiate those roles that we were just talking about in fire suppression on this landscape. Because of the increased risk to life and homes, there was some problems with mission alignment. So in the more remote landscapes, where it was mostly used for ranching, everybody, even the Bureau of Land Management and the ranchers were on the same page, like keep the rangeland fires small. When you started ending up in this more WUI context, a lot of people said that reported times where tactics had changed or shifted, where a rancher had been on a landscape holding a line, waiting for, air support, and they saw the air support coming and then it deviated to go and actually protect a home instead, and how that kind of tested the partnership in this landscape because the values started not aligning as much as it had in other parts of the state. So there was this conversation about whether it was a wildland fire suppression entity that would buffer the WUI, that the point of the program is to protect the WUI, which is what some of the more WUI-based organizations were responsible for. So it makes sense that they were coming from that angle. But then the RFPA members, again, were having more of this, we're a wildland firefighting entity that will back up the other responders who are, have fire protection responsibility for this landscape, like the Bureau of Land Management or IDL. So we're going to transition out of kind of this working landscape kind of scenario and go more into a more residentially based area and talk about their perceptions of their fire service organizations and how that impacts their performance of mitigations in the home ignition zone. So again, earlier we were making these ties between increasing fire risk and some increasing demands for fire protection that are both tied to that increasing risk, but also to WUI expansion and kind of the expectations of some new WUI occupants that are expecting certain services that are maybe provided in more urban context, and then now we're expecting them in a more rural context, and kind of tension that creates between the organizations that are there and the capacity they actually have versus what the citizens are expecting or the new residents are expecting. So local fire departments are often cited as being important partners in fire adaptation in local communities, right? So we have these instances where they are spearheading community wildfire protection plans or heavily involved in that process, where they are helping either put on education programs, fire co-steering FireWise initiatives, where they are involved in cost share grants to do community-wide fuel reduction, either in creating fuel breaks around communities or fuel reduction on individual lands. They might be sponsoring renting a wood chipper or other equipment for fuel mitigation on their properties. So we have a bit of information on how they operate in these spaces and how they've been incorporated, but we know a bit less about what residents' perceptions are of their fire service organizations, their local entities, in this larger wildfire management scenario. So if we have a large fire event or a wildland fire event that's not just a couple houses, how is your local fire department going to stack up, and how does that impact the mitigations you are taking on your private property? So just so we're all on the same page, I know most of us have this knowledge, but the area we tend to talk about dealing with fire risk mitigation in is the home ignition zone, right? So this 1 to 200 foot space around your home, where you are told to reduce fuels, to use fire-resistant siding materials in your building construction, to put, vents or to put mesh kind of like over your vents, to use dual pane glass windows. There are a lot of actions you can take to reduce your the ignitability of your home, and that's a big part of what we're talking about in the home ignition zone. So there's defensible space characteristics where you're mostly modifying the vegetation, and then there's structure ignitability characteristics where you're working on your home. We have a tendency in the performance mitigation literature to look at things as like conceptual clusters, or to aggregate those into big scores. And what I wanted to do here was examine mitigations individually to see if there were ways that we could see what characteristics were influencing whether those actions were performed for individual measures, rather than saying, okay, so people who mitigate more have more money or something along those lines. I wanted to look at what those individual influences were, because the logic here is that taking needles, raking needles around your house is going to take a different kind of labor load or amount of effort than replacing all the siding on your house. So the big questions in this project were, how do rural residents perceive their local fire service organization's capabilities? So kind of to take this first initial look at what that looks like. And then also, how does that, as well as resident characteristics and parcel characteristics, influence the mitigations that they are performing? The study area for this effort was in Newport, Washington, so kind of northeastern Washington. It's the county is characterized by some social fragmentation that we found in an earlier study, where we visited the area and found out that there were different, the county level was too large. We're talking about individual, like social adaptation or pathways towards fire adaptation. But there were a lot of different populations occupying this landscape, and that the characterization of having some amenity migrants in there, a lot of recreation opportunities, and a history of timber and agriculture tied to public lands, which here the Forest Service is this darker green, had meant that there were all these different people with different skills and abilities for dealing with fire risk on their landscape. And that also influenced the ways the different fire departments that were in this county felt that they could have conversations and the messaging they had to use to engage these communities. So we used a 16-page survey to ask people about their perceptions of their local fire suppression entity and its capabilities for dealing with wildfires in their area. We collected information on sociodemographics and the performance of 11 yes/no mitigation questions. So had you stacked your firewood more than 30 feet from your house? Yes, no. And that's kind of the measures here. We utilize kind of this mechanism for getting a high response rate from people is going door to door and bothering them until they actually give you the survey back. So we did a drop-off pickup approach to collect surveys from primary homeowners that we knew from tax data live there year round. So we went and visited them, told them about the study, and collected the survey that way. And then secondary homeowners or second homeowners got the survey through mail communications. So we ended up with 770 responses that we can then look at these questions through. So the several questions that related to fire service organizations and their capacities. I used a principal components analysis to look for the composite measures that might emerge from that, since no one had really taken a multidimensional look at trust in fire suppression organizations at the local level. And then also use those, put that and the other characteristics into a binary logistic regression to come up with, to look for what was some of the predictors for those 11 home ignition zone mitigations that we were interested in. So one of the first things here that was kind of interesting was that residents tended to mildly to moderately disagree that their local fire department had enough personnel to protect private properties at risk during a wildfire event in their area. They also mildly to moderately disagreed that the fire department could protect private property owners in the area during large fire events. And they also moderately disagreed that the fire department was capable of putting out fires in their area without assistance from extra local fire suppression assistance, so your federal and state partners. But they moderately trusted their fire department to come and respond to a fire on their property or on smaller scales within their community. And that's going to have some ramifications later. We also asked about their trust in state, federal partners, as well as privately contracted firefighters to deal with fire events on their property. And we see that they had mild or moderate trust in these different organizations. And something that resonates with the general knowledge that we have from rural sociology and from the general literature is that as you get more extra local, as you get farther away from the community or broader scale from the community, trust tends to diminish. So this resonates with that trend. So we put this into our regressions. We found that it's obvious from this that the same variables are not necessarily significant in all cases. So things I want to highlight here, for example, is when we're talking about installing non-flammable siding materials on your home, the less you trust your fire department, the more likely you were to utilize this in this mitigation. So that's kind of interesting in the idea that this is showing that if you didn't think that your fire department had the capability to come protect your home, you were potentially going to take more actions to protect your home. Another area that was interesting with this was the use of fire-resistant plants in your landscaping around your home. You were 2 times more likely to utilize that mitigation if you were a full-time resident rather than a part-time resident. And you also were 3 times more likely to utilize that if you had full wildfire insurance coverage. So that makes it either kind of can be interpreted in multiple ways, but some of the ways we can interpret that is that maybe that's a prerequisite or for getting insurance coverage. It could be that these individuals are already very risk adverse, so they might already be taking all the measures possible on their own, and they also have fire insurance, or it could be something that's coming through fire insurance messaging as ways that you can approach fire adaptation in your area. When we look at home defense actions, we look at, if you are worried about not having somebody respond to your home, are you preparing your home to be more defensible either by yourself or a firefighter by doing things like keeping your driveway clear enough for emergency vehicles to arrive, having a water supply established for firefighting like a pond or a lake, having a generator that would be used for supporting you during firefighting, having a safe zone on your property where people would shelter. And then another thing that's becoming increasingly kind of common in many of these recommendations is having sprinklers on your home installed at the rooftop, or having sprinklers on your property that can reach up to 50 feet from your home and increase the moisture content on your landscape to kind of keep the flame front away, right? And when we look at some of these that were, particularly interesting, was that when we look at that sprinkler kind of aspect, we do see things that we tend to expect, right? Like that if you had a higher income, you're more likely to implement both of these sprinkler systems installed. When we were on the former slide where we had like non-flammable siding, the only significant predictor there was that if you trusted your fire department less, you were more likely to implement that non-flammable siding, but income wasn't a significant predictor there. So that trust was really important. But here we see that the income is becoming an important part of whether you perform this mitigation action. Again, fire insurance coverage was an important predictor here as well. You're 4 times more likely to implement sprinklers on your home or have them on your roof if you had insurance coverage, full insurance coverage, and 3 times more likely to have them that would go up to 50 feet from your home, also if you had insurance coverage. Another thing that was interesting here is obviously your situational characteristics start coming into play in some of these cases. And so we saw that people who had property line, larger properties were more likely to have sprinkler systems installed that would reach up to 50 feet from their home than people with smaller parcel sizes. And this kind of shows that some of our fire adaptation recommendations might not be a good fit across all contexts just based alone on parcel size. You might not have a home ignition zone 3, you might not be able to get 50 feet away from your home. And so that kind of might get to be an issue or a kind of have a control on what you're able to do. So what are the takeaways here? Participants largely trusted their local fire departments to respond to fires on their property, but not to large fires. That's interesting in the context that we're starting to have some more conversations about kind of decentralizing to an extent some of the fire response initial attack kind of responsibilities, putting a little bit more responsibility on our local fire departments to become able to deal with wildland fire risk. And we see that with things like the RFPA program, the Rangeland Fire Protection Association program, where we're starting to incorporate civilians to deal with some of our gaps or some of the areas that we have problems addressing or going in and providing fire suppression and response to. And so we're seeing that also, I was curious about how that was going to start impacting the conversations going on in these areas. And what we see is that, the citizens, the people that the local fire departments have as their constituency, don't really expect them to deal with a wildland fire event. There was high trust in local fire departments, but that was not a significant predictor of performance in many of our mitigations. And that potentially has to do with the fact that we didn't account for resident local fire department interactions in our study. So we didn't ask if people had participated in FireWise program, if they had any messaging exposure. And there's also science out there talking about how there's trust is this multi-dimensional social concept. And so there are different aspects of trust that are important at different phases of a fire event. And what we were asking for here was one that was specific to fire response during the fire event. But what the science actually shows is that people are more concerned with whether a fire suppression organization is going to operate in line with what their values are, is going to actually protect what they're concerned about. And so that is something that can be incorporated into a future study. It also reflects that trust mechanism we're seeing here of not expecting the local fire departments to deal with wildland fire risk, but trusting them to deal with local. And some of the other stuff we're seeing is kind of perpetuating this idea that we have certain expectations. The 100 years of fire suppression, where we put out 98% of all fires, right, is kind of creating this idea that these extra local entities are going to come in and protect our properties. And what this tends to do is dampen their risk, individuals or residents' risk perceptions. So they don't feel as much of a need to address their wildfire risk because they're expecting to have some kind of response and protection. And that obviously has ramifications for how we actually whether we're dealing with our wildfire resilience issues or the space, and something more personal interest to me is the space that firefighters are then going into to now combat a fire event. So we also found that the influences of resident performance of these mitigations was highly variable. There was no one predictor that really resonated with all of them. And that kind of shows that these measures are all very, the mitigations all require very different kinds of investment, whether it's in labor or financial, and that it's hard to kind of create this way of saying that this is the way we are going to be able to predict this. I spoke about the components of trust. So moving into this last bit here on residents' intended evacuation behaviors and their performance of actions in the home ignition zone based on their mitigations. So in the US, we see that the civilians are largely encouraged to evacuate during a fire event. Part of this is because it decreases the number of people who are at risk. It makes the decision-making space kind of a little more clear. But there are a lot of reasons why we don't evacuate immediately during a fire event. And that is problems with ingress and egress. So you might not be able to get in and out of an area quickly. If there's visibility issues, if there's a lot of smoke on this landscape, are you going to be able to evacuate safely without getting into a car accident? What if there's downed trees? Housing density, the number of people living in an area, and then we have a lot of evacuation modeling that gives us a lot of information on that. If you have livestock you're trying to also protect and get out. And limited service can make it challenging to actually get evacuation orders out. So there are a lot of reasons why we prepare to potentially not evacuate in these scenarios. And so our alternatives to evacuation are things like staying and defending our property. So you're on a property to put out spot fires, and then you end up sheltering during the major flame front, and then you come back out after to also put out spot fires and ember fires to kind of protect your home. And then there's sheltering in place, which is not actively engaging in the fire front, but you're going to shelter from the flames and from the toxins during the fire event. There are some concerns about residents only preparing for their preferred evacuation behavior and not for wildfire risk in general. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more with this study. So what we're asking here is, what types of actions do residents intend to take during a fire event? How does that, and how does that influence the mitigations they are performing? So two I'm going to focus on anyway. So I used 9 questions that have been used in other evacuation studies, and random principal components analysis and a k-means cluster analysis to come up with the statements that created the groupings, and also come up with how individual respondents were assigned to those different groups. And then use a chi-square to examine the relationship between evacuation preferences and their mitigation action performance. So what this ends up looking like is people who were more likely to stay and defend, or were placed into the stay and defend group, were more likely to remain at home and help defend their property, or they strongly indicated they were going to perform that action. They also were tended to disagree with the statement that I would evacuate as soon as I hear about a fire that would impact my property. They were more likely to want more information around that before making the decision. So these people would also be more likely to wait and see. And they also were more likely to be members of split households, which comes out of some of the gender and wildfire literature, talking about how women and children are more likely to evacuate during a fire event, and males are more likely to stay and defend. And people who resonated with this statement ended up kind of loading into the stay and defend category group. People who are more likely to be or members of the evacuate group would evacuate when authorities told them to do so, would work with their neighbors to evacuate, and were not likely, or the least likely, to remain on their property regardless of evacuation orders. They are more likely to conform. And then we had a shelter in place or I don't know group. And so what we do here is people who are in a shelter, who intended to shelter in place, were part of this group, but also people who had indicated that they didn't really know what they would do during a fire event. And for that reason, those people, sometimes who don't have a plan, end up being in the defaulting into the shelter in place group because they can't make decisions. They don't have a plan when a fire is approaching, so they have to shelter in place. Something that I need to point out here is that in this population, we had a large proportion of the studied population that intended to stay and defend, who fell into the stay and defend group. And then the next largest category is that evacuate group, with also a portion of the population falling into the shelter in place or I don't know group. When we look at some mitigations, so these are mitigations that you perform in the home ignition zones 1 through 3. So, and they're all vegetation based. So it's saying I'm doing things like removing trees or spacing out shrubs, things along those lines. And what we see here is that people who plan to stay and defend are more likely than the evacuate group or the shelter in place group members to actually perform these actions that we're asking every resident of the WUI to perform to decrease the fire risk around their home. A part of this is because they're expecting to be on their home during a fire event, and so they are motivated to do these actions for their own protection and for the survivability of their home. So there's some concern here potentially around the fact that people who are planning to evacuate are less likely to implement these actions. So if we are campaigning for evacuation in all instances, does that mean that we are indirectly disincentivizing adaptation or risk mitigations that actually make it safer for our firefighters when you do evacuate and leave fire suppression up to fire professionals? We also saw when we look at our property defense mitigations, so have you put a safe zone in? Do you have a generator? Do you have a water supply for firefighting? Have you made your driveway wide enough for emergency managers to come into your property and also to escape from your property if they need to? and do sprinklers, the sprinkler questions, we see that the stay and defend group is again more likely to have implemented some of these actions. And for the water supply in particular, they're more likely than both groups to have that available. They're also more likely to have their driveway wide enough and sprinklers that reach up to 50 feet from their home. They're also more likely to have a generator on site, but only than the evacuate group. So now we're going to look quickly at some immediate zone actions again. So this is those non-flammable siting, spacing firewood more than 50 feet from your home, using fire-resistant plants in your landscaping. And what we see here again is that there are some actions that the stay and defend group is more likely to perform than the other groups. And those include the stacking firewood, removing the accumulation of needles and leaves from roofs, gutters, or decks, and removing flammable materials from the 5 feet, immediate zone, the 5 feet around your home. Not talking about that. So when we're talking now about what are the takeaways from this, a large portion of the population intends to stay and defend their property. And this was also found in a Pavalio et al. Study in 2014 in Flathead, Montana, where a larger portion of the population intended to stay and defend their property. Now, this might just be something that's very true in more rural contexts, but it would be interesting to look at this in more urban spaces. What we did just see here, for example, with the CZU complex fires over in the Santa Cruz Mountains, was that there were entire communities that decided to kind of implement more stay and defend. There were individuals that were staying and defending their property. So this might not just be a rural mindset kind of thing. Most of the population anticipates an evacuation order. And that's a problem in rural areas, but also more urban areas, right? We've seen that with the Camp Fire and some of the other fires where the CZU complex, again, some folks didn't get evacuation orders and also did not get them in time to actually react and evacuate. They ended up having to default to sheltering in place because they could not make it out safely. So we have some concerns in rural areas in particular about the service and ability to use text messages and instant alerts, whether phone trees go down if we still have landlines involved. How do we disseminate that in rural spaces where we already have a lot of strain on our emergency services and houses tend to be much farther apart? How do we deliver those evacuation notices if that's the major cue that people are responding to? And the big takeaway here was also that stay and defend individuals are more likely to perform most mitigations than members of the evacuate group. And so, and often also the shelter in place, I don't know group. So if this has some consequences and some opportunities potentially for firefighters and fire managers who are looking to promote landscape level fire resilience. If a lot of our conversations right now are over saying, leave early, evacuate early. And by doing that, people can disassociate their private responsibility for mitigation and also not prepare themselves for those situations like we are seeing in some of these fires that are fast moving, that you're not prepared for the worst case. And the worst case might be sheltering in place or staying and defending. So by changing those conversations, we might actually be able to both get closer to our fire resilience goals, but also have increased just safety and backup plans for people who are living in fire-prone areas. So some overarching lessons here I want to talk about is that if we're going to move towards, especially in more rural areas, there's a lot of talk about, taking some of the onus off of federal land managers and giving it back to the states around some fire suppression. Not necessarily in the California context, but in some of the study areas I was working in for this work. And something that we have to acknowledge with that is that a lot of these rural counties and rural areas are going through some big sociodemographic changes that reallocating some of this responsibility might not be feasible when most of our young people are moving to cities to get jobs and such. So those are things that we have to start also incorporating into our expectations as we're talking about fire resilience. It's also, the Rangeland Fire Protection Association program was kind of this novel approach. It had existed in Oregon since the 1960s, but kind of got a revamp when Idaho took over the program and kind of and implemented the program. And then Oregon has also seen an increase in their Rangeland Fire Protection Association programs. So novel approaches. How do we incentivize citizen engagement in these issues? And in certain communities, things like creating civilian opportunities for civilians to engage in ways that make sense for them and their cultural backgrounds can be a way to create these fire adapted community concepts in these landscapes. There's also a need to look, kind of some of the work I was doing, right, is looking at kind of the multidimensionality of trust. There are multiple components that go into measuring trust. And a lot of times the way we look at the influence of trust, especially in mitigation studies, is saying, how much do you trust the fire department? We don't get to all these other aspects of trust to create a multidimensional measure like we do when we're talking about trust in the federal government or trust in state governments in natural resource management in general. And I think that there's room to grow there. And also, like we were just talking about, there's potentially a lot of interest to stay and defend in rural areas, but potentially in other contexts. And something that they do in Australia through the Stay and Defend and Leave Early kind of campaign, or kind of the way they do their messaging, is that there tend to be opportunities to work with fire managers to consult with them about how safe your home is for defending, having that specific conversation. How do I adapt? How do I do this? You go through evaluations for your mental and your physical health about whether you should be able to stay and defend. So there are ways that we can, take some of that and create that opportunity in the US if we can get through, if it's appropriate and if fire managers are supportive of those kinds of conversations. And the idea that we can just prepare for sheltering in place or staying defending as a last resort could be a useful kind of lens to go through to promote some of our fire resilience goals. So with that, I'm gonna wrap up and open for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I realize some of you may not know how to do this, but you have an opportunity to find those little hands and clap in your chat box. Thank you so much for such a relevant presentation for the many conversations that we're having right now across California and more broadly across the West. A quick reminder to everyone, in about 9 minutes here, we're going to move over to the discussion room Zoom. The link, if you didn't already have it in your email, is in the chat box. If you have questions for Dr. Stasiewicz, please put them in the Q&A. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen. There's sort of a control bar, and there's a little thing that says Q&A. So you can go into there and we'll go ahead and take some questions here. So the first question is related to the sprinklers that you were talking about. And this question of, were the people who were installing sprinklers, were they pulling from a shared water source, like a city system, or more of an independent water source? Because of this concern that running sprinklers from a shared system may actually impede water pressure for firefighter needs, or that they won't work, right? That you'll actually lose your water pressure entirely.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I did not specifically incorporate that into this, but I could say anecdotally that the places that I did visit, again, I only ended up visiting in person about a third of the sites that we ended up doing the drop-off pickup with, that some of those places had their own ponds. So some of the conversations I was able to have with some of those landowners, they were either part of the fire department potentially, or lived next to the a fire chief, or had some kind of knowledge in that arena, and they had created some shared ponds that they were using to draw water from in these contexts. But that is going to be a concern and would be interesting, especially in cases like this where we are collecting survey data that's geocoded, so it can be brought to a parcel. We can start overlaying some of that, but I haven't done that work yet. But thank you for the question.
Another question is about the perceived differences in the mosaics that you're describing, and sort of this drive for local control, whether it's created disconnected wildfire plans and tactics. And the question is specifically, can this decentralized strategic approach create sort of a diffuse responsibility as it relates to roles and responsibilities to prepare for and prevent wildfires, and the sort of the suboptimal use of scarce firefighting resources. And the sort of second piece of that question is, are there best practices that you've come across to align these local strategies to ensure an integrated approach?
Yeah, that's a lot of good questions. So I would say that I'm really interested to see where this progresses and in what context this progresses, right? So we've already seen this idea of decentralized or increased cooperation around fire management in, for example, prescribed burn associations. So those have been proliferating kind of across the West, and I realized that they came to California within the last couple of years and have been kind of expanding in this arena as well. But that's a way for introducing, again, prescribed fire across private and public land ownerships while dealing with liability concerns, kind of in the same way we were dealing with citizen liability concerns in the public landscape. And actually the RFPA program, at least as it's conceived in Idaho, drew a bit from the Prescribed Burn Association example. So that's kind of one way that we can kind of get at that. And I know that, so I've had some conversations with individuals who are concerned, about this decentralized approach. Does that end up absolving, the agencies of some fire forest management? For example, people are concerned that by putting more onus on the private property owners, are we going to start losing some of the incentive to deal with forest health initiatives? And my idea on that and on, do we want to diminish the Forest Service's capacity to respond to events? I don't think that's necessary. I think what we need here in the idea of decentralizing is not necessarily saying, you can look at graphs of the trends of the proportion of the Forest Service personnel that are in fire and the proportion that are actually in National Forest Management. And we can see the shifts between the 90s and the 2015, and that they've shifted into more fire management away from forest management. And we've seen that kind of cascade into part of this larger landscape level resilience kind of issue, right? So what I'm saying with decentralizing, I'm not saying that we need to completely scale back. I'm saying that what we're trying to do, and the idea here is that communities are going to be closer in a lot of cases to fires. And if we want to keep fires small, if that's the goal on our landscapes, and I think this is what those federal managers that I've talked to that have brought this up are meaning as well, is that if we need to increase our initial attack capacities. And part of that is giving, if it's giving ranchers and loggers training and fire behavior so they can safely respond. If it's helping rural fire departments get some more additional training in wildland fire specific techniques. There are, if it's vamping up things like prescribed burn councils, treks, things like that. There are a lot of ways that we can start doing that. I don't know if that gets at all of that, but feel free to ask again.
Okay. Another question is related to the discussion that you were providing about trust in organizations. And the question is, did you identify any variables in the wildland firefighter sort of performance and rhetoric and presentation that affected community trust in those organizations?
Effective community resources. Yeah, so something that if I could do this study again, something I would start incorporating more of would be a lot more of those elements of trust. So I had initially thought that that trust in the local fire department to respond to a fire on my property was going to also load into a factor with their capacity to deal with fire, a wildfire event, and their ability to deal with wildfire without extra local assistance, because that starts getting at things about talking about equipment, talking about personnel, in addition to talking about general trust. If I could do this again, I would start incorporating some additional trust measures that are from the broader literature related to, do you trust their expertise? And that's something that comes into play a lot more with when we're talking about trust in federal land managers or land management organizations who deal with natural resource management issues more broadly. So if I'm answering this question correctly, that's kind of the way I would go about that.
Okay. Let's see, and then I'll do one last question. We've got about 2 minutes here. How much do you think that communication and messaging from fire departments could influence that trust and then filter down to homeowner mitigation strategies and evacuation plans?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that there's been some really good work that's come out recently. There was a study that looked specifically at the roles that rural fire departments or fire departments saw that they had in community adaptation and response. And I think that the messaging comes out to be really important, but something here that, thinking this idea of social fragmentation, of having multiple different pockets of social types on a landscape, means that a fire department might have 2 or 3 different archetype communities in it, right? You might have ranchers sharing the same landscape as high amenity, high resource individuals who, or ski towns, right? So if a fire department has multiple pockets within it, it's going to need to tailor its messaging, not just to its jurisdiction, but to those pockets of communities. And so that's something that I think starts becoming, really interesting and important here, and that, the messaging techniques can change. Some of the fire departments I've worked with have talked about, they have properties that they definitely go talk to in rural areas because you're going to not be met in a very hospitable way is probably the nicest way I could put that. And then other ones that have gone around and either put different colored tape or different colored rocks on their mailboxes and part of a messaging campaign to explain that we're not going to respond to this home because it's not safe. And that's tracked really well in certain communities versus others, right? So there are a number of different ways that fire departments can approach that.
Okay. It is 4 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and move over to the Zoom chat room. The link is once again in the chat, and it will allow you to move over into that Zoom discussion room if you have additional questions for Dr. Stasiewicz. And I apologize that we didn't get to all of the questions in the Q&A, but we can go ahead and move over there and continue to ask these questions. Really quickly, next week, our guest will be Dr. Susan Pritchard with the University of Washington out of the Pacific Northwest. And so I hope you'll join us again next week. Thank you all. Let's please move over to the other Zoom room.